Do you live in the Philippines? Do you live in Indonesia, Japan, along the coast of Alaska, in Chile, in Peru, or anywhere else in that enormous arc of fault lines and subduction zones that wraps around almost the entire Pacific Ocean? If the answer is yes, you need to watch this full video, because the ground beneath the Ring of Fire has not stopped moving this month, and in the past few days alone, 5 significant seismic events have struck at separate points around that arc within hours of each other, and most people reading the news today still have no idea how wide and how relentless this stretch of seismic activity has actually been. Let's start with the number that anchors everything else happening this week, because without it, none of the other events make full sense. On the 8th of June 2026 at 7:37 in the morning, Philippine Standard Time, the ground beneath the southern Philippines shook with a magnitude 7.8 earthquake, the most powerful to strike the Philippines since the magnitude 8.0 Moro Gulf earthquake of August 1976. The epicenter sat approximately 24 to 32 kilometers west-southwest of Cablalan, in Sarangani province on the island of Mindanao, at a depth of roughly 33 to 55 kilometers, depending on which agency's updated catalog you check, which is common in the immediate aftermath of events this size. The United States Geological Survey attributed the rupture to thrust faulting along the Cotabato Trench, a major subduction structure where the oceanic crust of the Sunda Plate beneath the Celebes Sea is being forced down beneath the Philippines mobile belt, a convergence happening at a rate of approximately 100 millimeters per year. That is not a slow geological abstraction. That is 4 inches of accumulated stress every single year. Building, building, building until something gives. What gave on June 8th gave violently. The USGS pager system, the agency's automated tool for estimating human exposure to dangerous shaking within minutes of an event, placed approximately 15 million people in the zone of moderate to severe shaking. 15 million. That is more than the entire population of New York City or London, all of them subject to ground acceleration strong enough to damage buildings and collapse weakened structures in the space of roughly 60 seconds. The city of General Santos, a major port city of more than 700,000 people and the regional hub for the southern Philippine tuna export industry, reported several buildings collapsed, including a well-known fast food restaurant that had served the city for years. Key infrastructure was damaged. The Civil Aviation Authority of the Philippines suspended all operations at General Santos City Airport. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos announced school suspension across the affected areas and directed disaster response teams to mobilize immediately. But here is the problem with calling this a single earthquake and moving on, because the seismic record does not allow that. Within hours of the main shock, the region was recording aftershocks, not the occasional small tremor, but a continuous dense swarm that by Monday evening had already produced more than 150 aftershocks. The largest of those aftershocks reached magnitude 6.5. A magnitude 6.5 would be a major news event on its own in most parts of the world. In the Philippines, on June 8th, it was an aftershock. A landslide triggered in the mountainous interior of Sarangani province killed at least 13 villagers in one community alone. Tsunami waves generated by the main shock reached approximately 1 meter in height along the coasts of Kiamba and Masim in Sarangani, and Calamansig in Sultan Kudarat, with a maximum measured run-up height of 2.5 meters at Labak, Sultan Kudarat, and the tsunami traveling 1 kilometer upstream through a nearby river mouth at that same location. Smaller waves were measured in Indonesia, Palau, and as far away as southern Japan. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center initially warned that waves up to 10 feet were possible along some Philippine coastlines. By the time the final damage picture took shape, at least 78 people were confirmed dead, more than 1,300 were injured, 31 remained missing, and more than 84,000 homes across Mindanao had been damaged or destroyed. This is not an earthquake that ended on June 8th. Its consequences are still unfolding right now on the 23rd of June, with communities displaced, infrastructure cracked, and the ground beneath Sarangani still shaking with aftershocks that have continued week after week. And now it gets worse, because that same seismically active region did not quiet down after June 8th. By the weekend of June 14th and 15th, another cluster of moderate earthquakes rattled the southern Philippines, this time including a magnitude 5.2 east-northeast of Hinatuan and a magnitude 5.0 near Sarangani, at depths ranging from 21 to 44 miles. These were not freak events. They were the documented continuation of a fault system that released its initial energy on June 8th and has been redistributing residual stress through aftershocks ever since. As of June 23rd, magnitude 4.5 aftershocks are still being recorded near Glan and Sargan, still logged in real time by PHIVOLCS, still felt by families and communities whose roofs and walls are already cracked from the original rupture, still forcing engineers to complete safety assessments before displaced residents can return to their homes. 20,000 people remain displaced. The seismic sequence that began on June 8th has never fully stopped. This next part matters. because the Philippines was not the only place along the Ring of Fire moving violently this month. On June 16, 2026, 8 days after the Mindanao quake, a magnitude 6.7 earthquake struck 43 kilometers east-southeast of Palu in the Indonesian island of Sulawesi at a depth of only 10 kilometers. 10 kilometers is not deep. In earthquake science, depth matters enormously because a shallow rupture transfers far more energy directly to the surface above it than a deeper one of the same magnitude. The USGS maximum modified Mercalli intensity for this event reached 8.0, a rating classified as violent, the kind of shaking that causes serious damage to ordinary structures, partial collapses of weaker buildings, and significant ground deformation in areas vulnerable to liquefaction. The USGS pager system assigned a yellow alert, indicating local impact was possible, and that some injuries and damage were likely. Most people are missing this part of the story completely, and it is the part that makes June 16th in Palu so much heavier than any raw number suggests. On the 28th of September 2018, Palu was struck by a magnitude 7.5 earthquake and triggered something that the geotechnical engineering world is still studying: liquefaction, a process where saturated soil essentially behaves like a liquid under intense shaking, swallowed entire residential neighborhoods. Houses sank, roads buckled. A phenomenon called flow slide carried whole sections of built-up land into the sea. A locally generated tsunami raced across Palu Bay and struck the city within minutes of the main shock. More than 4,000 people died, many of them in the liquefaction alone. The Palu earthquake of 2018 fundamentally changed how Indonesian authorities, researchers, and community planners think about earthquake risk in that specific basin, because the geology of the bay and its surrounding lowlands is so prone to liquefaction that any major shallow earthquake in the same zone carries the memory of 2018 every single time. On June 16th of this year, the ground moved again near that same city. The magnitude was lower than 2018. The death toll was not comparable. But the shaking intensity reached violent levels at a place that already knows what violent shaking in this geology can do, and that knowledge does not make the experience of it any less terrifying for the families still living there. And on that same day, June 16th, while Indonesia was processing its 6.7, Japan recorded a magnitude 5.5 earthquake that hit at around 7:45. In the evening local time, with its epicenter in southern Ibaraki Prefecture, generating strong shaking in Gunma and Saitama prefectures, both of which are densely populated regions northwest of Tokyo. Japan's meteorological agency confirmed no tsunami threat, and no major casualties from that event. But the moment of strong shaking in a metropolitan region of tens of millions of people was real, documented, and felt by real people, inside real buildings, during a real workday evening. Two events, magnitude 6.7 in Indonesia and magnitude 5.5 in Japan, within the same 24-hour window at opposite ends of a volcanic and seismic arc, stretching from Southeast Asia toward the North Pacific. And both of them arriving in the same week that the Philippines was still counting its dead from June 8th. Here's why this is serious in a way that most headline coverage fails to communicate. Each of these events, the Philippines 7.8, the Indonesia 6.7, the Japan 5.5, sits on a separate but geologically related piece of the same system, the convergence zone, where the Indo-Australian, Philippine Sea, Pacific, and Eurasian plates are all simultaneously grinding against each other, subducting beneath each other, and releasing stress in the form of earthquakes that range from the barely detectable to the catastrophic. Since 1900, the Cotabato Trench region near Mindanao alone has produced at least 35 earthquakes, of magnitude 7.0 or greater within 300 kilometers of June's rupture zone. The Palu region of Sulawesi has its own long and devastating history. Japan's Ibaraki Prefecture sits within the same Honshu arc system that produced the magnitude 9.0 Tohoku earthquake of March 2011, and the tsunami that killed nearly 20,000 people and triggered the Fukushima nuclear crisis. None of these events are random. They are all expressions of the same basic physical reality, that the Pacific Ring of Fire is not a metaphor, and it is not a label on a map. It is the most seismically active region on the surface of this planet, producing roughly 90% of all the earthquakes ever recorded, and right now, in June of 2026, multiple segments of it are releasing energy simultaneously. One more thing you need to know is what the seismic catalog looks like in Kamchatka this same week, because the context there adds a dimension to this story that most coverage has entirely overlooked. On June 19th at 7:52 UTC, a magnitude 5.8 earthquake struck 144 kilometers from Petropavlovsk, Kamchatsky, at a depth of 10 kilometers. 31 minutes later, on the same date at 8:03 UTC, a magnitude 5.2 struck 156 kilometers from the same city at a depth of 5 kilometers. Both shallow, both in Kamchatka. Then on June 20th, at 3:49 UTC, another magnitude 5.8 registered 153 kilometers from Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky at 33 kilometers depth. That is 3 significant seismic events in Kamchatka within approximately 20 hours, sitting in a peninsula that absorbed a magnitude 8.8 earthquake on July 30th, 2020, an event that remains the most powerful earthquake recorded anywhere on Earth in the past decade. The M8 struck approximately 130 kilometers southeast of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. The aftershock sequence from a magnitude 8.8 does not end in days or weeks. It can continue for years, and the M5. 8 events recorded on June 19th and 20th are consistent with the ongoing stress redistribution following that enormous release. These are not isolated tremors. They are the continued conversation of a crust still settling from one of the most violent seismic events of this century. What happened next changed everything about how the week of June 22nd reads on the global seismic record, because by the time that week arrived, the Ring of Fire was producing significant events across multiple, widely separated nodes simultaneously. On June 22nd, a magnitude 4.8 earthquake struck near Tonga at a depth of 35 kilometers, followed within the same hour by a magnitude 4.7 at 109 kilometers depth in the South Pacific Ocean, at coordinates placing it in the same Tonga region. On the same day, June 22nd, a magnitude 4.8 struck 76 kilometers from Kimbe, in the West New Britain province of Papua New Guinea, at 108 kilometers depth. And continuing on June 23rd, the latest available data shows a magnitude 4.5 striking 49 kilometers from Glan in Soxargen in the southern Philippines, which is not an abstract dot on a plate boundary map. Glan sits within the same province cluster still dealing with displaced residents, damaged structures, and ongoing aftershock anxiety from the June 8th magnitude 7.8. Now the focus shifts to what all of this means in terms of accumulated seismic energy, because the numbers get large enough to be almost impossible to intuitively grasp until they are converted into something tangible. The Volcano Discovery Earthquake Monitoring System, which aggregates data from more than 50 international seismic networks, estimates that the total combined seismic energy released by events recorded in the past 24 hours alone, as of the 23rd of June, is approximately 2.6 times 10 to the 13th joules, equivalent to roughly 6,225 tons of TNT, or approximately 0.4 atomic bombs of the type dropped on Hiroshima. That is for a single day, and that calculation does not reach back to include June 8th's magnitude 7.8, which alone released an order of magnitude more energy than the entire daily total cited above. A magnitude 7.8 releases approximately 1,000 times more energy than a magnitude 5.8. This is why, in earthquake science, the magnitude scale is one of the most misunderstood numbers in all of public science communication. Every single step of one full unit on the magnitude scale represents a roughly 32-fold increase in energy released. A 7.8 is not slightly bigger than a 5.8. It is roughly 1,000 times more energetic. This is where it becomes dangerous for anyone living along these fault lines to treat these events as abstract, distant problems that belong to someone else's geography. General Santos City, a regional economic hub of more than 700,000 people, lost buildings it cannot easily replace. Families in Sarangani province who survived the earthquake have been displaced for more than 2 weeks now. The Indonesian city of Palu, which already rebuilt itself physically and psychologically after 2018's liquefaction and tsunami catastrophe, felt its ground move violently again on June 16th at a depth of only 10 kilometers. Farmers in rural Sulawesi do not have earthquake insurance. Displaced families in Mindanao do not have FEMA-equivalent backup infrastructure that arrives in days. When a school collapses in these regions, it does not get rebuilt in weeks. When a coastal home is swept by even a 1-meter tsunami, the family living in it starts again from essentially nothing. These are not hypothetical human consequences written into a risk assessment document somewhere. They are the documented, reported, ongoing reality of what these seismic events have produced across the past 3 weeks of June 2026. This next part matters because the historical comparison sitting behind all of this is not ancient or distant. On August 15th, 1976, a magnitude 8.0 earthquake struck the Moro Gulf region, approximately 118 kilometers from June's rupture zone in the southern Philippines, along the same general system of tectonic structures associated with the Cotabato Trench. That 1976 earthquake, the strongest to strike the Philippines in the decades before June 8th of this year, generated a tsunami that killed 8,000 people. 8,000. In a single event. In many of the same coastal communities that have been rebuilding and living with seismic risk in this region for generations since. June 8th's magnitude 7.8 was slightly smaller than the 1976 event. The tsunami it generated was measurably smaller. The death toll, at 78, confirmed with 31 still missing, was a fraction of 1976's. But it is worth being very specific about why the outcomes differed, because it was not geology alone. It was early warning systems, faster communications, more practiced evacuation protocols, and the tragic institutional memory of what happened in 1976 that helped limit the death toll. And even with all of those advantages in place in June 2026, 78 people still died, 1,300 more were injured, and 84,000 homes were damaged or destroyed across Mindanao. One more thing you need to know before this story reaches its current edge is where the global baseline actually sits, because one of the most persistent misconceptions in earthquake communication is the idea that a week with multiple significant events across the Ring of Fire is somehow unusual. Seismologists have established through the long historical catalog that the planet produces on average roughly 14.9 earthquakes of magnitude, 7 or greater every single year, roughly 1.2 per month, and approximately 121 earthquakes of magnitude 6 or greater per year, which works out to about 10 per month, or more than 2 per week, every week, somewhere on Earth. The global average for magnitude 5 or greater earthquakes sits at approximately 1,900 per year, roughly 5.3 per day. What the Ring of Fire is doing right now, producing a dense cluster of significant events at multiple nodes within the same month, is not a departure from the historical baseline. It is the baseline finally being paid attention to, because a magnitude 7.8 with a real tsunami and a real death toll made it impossible to look away. But that is not the real story tonight, and it would miss everything important to let that scientific context collapse into complacency. The real story is that the tectonic forces driving all of this, the Philippine Sea Plate grinding northwestward into the Eurasian Plate at 100 millimeters per year, the Indo-Australian Plate diving beneath Sulawesi, the Pacific Plate descending beneath Kamchatka and the Aleutians, the Nazca Plate burrowing under South America at roughly 75 millimeters per year along the Peru-Chile Trench, none of these motions have paused. They do not pause. They will not pause. Every millimeter of accumulated strain that does not release in a moderate event is a millimeter that builds toward the next larger one. And the distribution of when and where that release happens is one of the most genuinely and honestly unsolved problems in all of Earth science. Seismologists can describe what has happened with extraordinary precision. They cannot tell you with confidence what is coming, or exactly when, or exactly where, beyond the fundamental certainty that the same fault zones that ruptured in the past will rupture again on their own schedule, indifferent to human preparation, human economics, or human politics. And tonight changes the timeline in one very specific way that the data from June 23rd makes unavoidable. The Kamchatka region, which absorbed the M8. 8 earthquake of July 2025 and has been producing its own ongoing seismic activity since, is sitting in the same general area as PHIVOLCS volcano, which remains at aviation color code orange, with an actively growing lava dome. The Cotabato Trench region, which just produced a M7 8 and is still generating magnitude 4 plus aftershocks more than 2 weeks later, is surrounded by the same general volcanic chain that includes Mayon, still actively erupting with thousands of residents and evacuation centers. The Palu region of Sulawesi, which shook again at magnitude 6.7 in June, lies at the intersection of some of the most complex tectonic geometry anywhere in the Indo-Pacific. And all of these places, all of these fault lines, all of these displaced families, damaged buildings, continuing aftershocks, and monitored volcanoes exist simultaneously, right now, on the same 23rd day of June 2026, while the rest of the world watches something else entirely. Somewhere along the Cotabato Trench tonight, the seafloor is still moving in millimeter adjustments that seismometers can detect and human beings cannot feel. Somewhere beneath Kamchatka, the Pacific Plate is still descending at the same relentless rate that has never paused since before our species existed. And somewhere in General Santos City and Sarangani Province, in Palu, in communities that do not make international news, but bear the full weight of what happens when tectonic forces finally announce themselves, families are still waiting for the ground to stop moving. The Ring of Fire does not send warnings that it is awake. The seismic record simply makes clear, entry by entry and aftershock by aftershock, that it never went to sleep.